Coming up on Energy Switch, we'll talk about the benefits and challenges of electric cars.
It takes time for transformation. It takes time for the vehicle fleet to turn over. Right now, it's only 5%. That's really low economies of scale. And so prices are high, yes. But as we push for more electric vehicles to come into the market, as they learn and figure out new manufacturing processes, those costs will come down.
If the goal of the electric vehicle revolution is to reduce transportation emissions, then it's not about getting electric vehicles on the road, it's about getting gasoline cars off the road.
In this discussion, part one of electric cars, pros and cons.
Funding for Energy Switch was provided in part by the University of Texas at Austin, leading research in energy and the environment for a better tomorrow. What starts here changes the world. And by EarthX, an international nonprofit working towards a more sustainable future. See more at earthx.org.
I'm Scott Tinker, and I'm an energy scientist. I work in the field, lead research, speak around the world, write articles, and make films about energy. This show brings together leading experts on vital topics in energy and climate. They may have different perspectives, but my goal is to learn and illuminate and bring diverging views together towards solutions. Welcome to the Energy Switch. Electric cars are quiet, fast, and efficient. You can fill them up in your garage overnight. And they produce no local emissions. But they're expensive, and their subsidies have gone mostly to the wealthy. And the critical minerals for their batteries are controlled by foreign powers, unless we begin more domestic mining. We'll look at all this and much more with my expert guests. Beia Spiller is a fellow at Resources for the Future, where she directs their transportation program. Before that, she was lead senior economist at Environmental Defense Fund. David Rapson is also an energy economist for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas and the Chancellor's Leadership Professor of Economics at the University of California, Davis. In this episode of Energy Switch, electric cars, pros and cons, part one. So welcome, everybody. Really glad you're here with us. Most of us in the U.S. are driving gasoline cars or maybe diesel. Why do we care about EVs?
Well, EVs have a huge environmental benefit, right? They remove all tailpipe emissions from the road. And one of the biggest reasons why I think electric vehicles are so exciting is the potential for them to really reduce the harm that transportation pollution has on disadvantaged communities. These communities tend to live closer to highways and major roadways, as well as depots. And so if we begin to electrify that, we can start to improve the health and well-being of these communities who have been so historically damaged by transportation pollution.
The big environmental justice piece to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. David?
Well, the first thing I have to say, I work for the Federal Reserve, and so all of the opinions I have today are my own and not the Fed's. We care about electric vehicles because we care about climate change. You know, climate change is real, it's an urgent problem, and decarbonizing transportation is one of the most difficult aspects of that. And we have this technology that offers us a pathway where we decarbonize the grid and we switch from liquid fuels to electric vehicles. At least that's the vision.
Yeah. Let's start with kind of the market. How deeply have EVs penetrated the market so far? U.S. at least.
It's about 5.5%, and that's grown really rapidly over the past few years.
Right. U.S. sells about 15 million cars a year, so we're looking at...
It's about 750,000.
Approaching 1 million cars,
absolutely,
EVs a year.
And we expect that number to go up a lot over the coming years.
Right.
You know, there really has been a rapid increase in the adoption of this technology.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's a very specific segment of the market that has taken off. Most of the consumers are very wealthy, and they're driving around cars that cost, you know, 60, 70, 80, sometimes thousand, more dollars. So these are not inexpensive cars, and they're not accessible to the vast majority of the market at this point.
Yeah,
well,
that's interesting.
Can I push back on that a little bit? First of all, the great thing about Tesla was that they made these cars cool. Beforehand, everybody was thinking about these EVs as sort of horribly ugly, as, lacking in horsepower, lacking in performance.
Right.
And so now all of a sudden, people are thinking about EVs as, wow, this is a really cool car. We can have environmentally friendly driving, but also have it be really fun to drive. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, Prius is pretty ugly.
Interesting. Well,
And that was
my kids are all beautiful.
Right.
But,
that was like the main way that people were able to, improve the environmental impact of their driving.
how do we see that globally? EVs.
EVs have really taken off in China and in Europe. So in places where they want to signal that they're taking climate change seriously, electric vehicles are, the pathway to signal that. I think it's worth noting, though, that even as they increase in the market share of new vehicles, it's a lot smaller as a share of the cars on the road.
Right.
And, I think we're going to come back to this a few times, because if the goal of the electric vehicle revolution is to reduce transportation emissions, then it's not about getting electric vehicles on the road, it's about getting gasoline cars off the road.
That's interesting. In addition, China and the EU, China consumes 5 times more petroleum than it produces. So there's a practical driver here too. We don't have oil. We need something else for our vehicles. And so it's climate, but it's also, particularly in China, really practical. Let's electrify this stuff, right?
Well, sure, but I mean, they're going to have to get inputs for electricity as well. So, we saw what happened with Europe's electricity sector in 2022 when Russia cut off the flows of natural gas. What happened to Germany as they shifted towards coal. And China is also importing a lot of coal and building a lot of coal-fired plants.
Correct. It's not good for climate, but it's good for transportation security.
That's exactly right. And if we as economists could, wave our wand and do this efficiently, I think we'd have a lot more grid decarbonization happening before there's deep penetration of EVs in the market.
Interesting.
Because a lot, our grid worldwide is about 60% fossil fuels. 40% of that is coal worldwide. And you flip those numbers in the US, we're about 60% fossil fuels on the electric grid in the US, where it's 40% natural gas, so it's a little bit cleaner. But still, these cars have been branded, particularly in California, as zero emissions vehicles. And, that's true at the tailpipe, but that's not true if what you care about is climate change.
Right. You agree?
The idea that we need to wait until the grid is decarbonized to make this transition, I think that's a fallacy. Because it takes time for transformation. It takes time for the vehicle fleet to turn over. Right now, it's only 5%. That's really low economies of scale. And so prices are high, yes. But as we push for more electric vehicles to come into the market, as they learn and figure out new manufacturing processes, those costs will come down. Another thing that I want to point out is there needs to be learning on the side of the customers, right? So understanding when's the right time to charge. How can we charge in a way that minimizes our emissions? Understanding how do we deal with range anxiety, right? And so if charging stations are well networked, and we have a lot of them everywhere, then range anxiety can decrease. People can understand that they're going to be able to use these vehicles appropriately. So if we wait, we're adding extra decades to that whole learning process, which we really should be accelerating right now.
I agree with everything that Beia just said, and what she's really pointed out is the beginning of what's a really long list of obstacles. So, maybe we go a little bit slower. We learn, maybe not at as fast a rate, but we allow other technologies to be innovated as well. For example, battery storage technology, which will help decarbonize the grid, or hydrogen fuel technology, which will make electric vehicles, maybe not 100% of the vision. And so, I think foreclosing these other technology options by going all in on EVs, it's a little risky.
Hold on, let me push back on that for a second. Because if we were going to try to make the vehicles on the road be both hydrogen and electric, we will need a massive infrastructure investment. Right? Not just the charging stations that we're currently investing in, but also the fueling stations for these hydrogen vehicles, for these fuel cell vehicles. The billions of dollars that would cost society to make parallel investments in charging and fueling stations is massive.
Yeah. So let's just touch on where electric electricity, batteries make sense, vehicle size, that kind of thing. What are your thoughts on that? We'll come back over here, David.
You know, within the medium heavy-duty vehicle sector, there's a lot of use cases that can do very well with electric, particularly smaller vehicles right now, delivery vehicles, garbage trucks, school buses, and even transit buses. Right now, the cost is quite a bit higher. How can we bring it down? And it's not just going to be through subsidization of the vehicle purchase, because there's so many other different challenges within the medium heavy-duty vehicle sector that we're not going to be able to just throw money at the purchaser and think that that's going to be able to reduce the cost.
Yeah, I mean, a motor, electric motor is so efficient. Combustion engine not, but gasoline is so efficient, dense per unit weight or volume as compared to a battery. So you get this kind of strange trade-off. Your thoughts on the bigger vehicles?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that electric vehicle technology is most promising in light vehicles because batteries are so heavy and because liquid fuels like gasoline and diesel are very energy dense. And so they make sense for these bigger applications. For urban driving, I think electric vehicles are great. And you don't even necessarily need batteries as big as the ones that Tesla is putting in, or the ones that are being mandated under subsidy thresholds in current policy. I think, we should
When you say big, give me a feel for weight in a car of a battery, like a four-door sedan.
Well, a typical electric vehicle can be, 500 to 1,000 pounds more heavy than its non-battery counterpart. So
whereas 20 gallons of gasoline weighs about 100 pounds.
Yeah, exactly. And you're putting it in a $100 like polyethylene tank. It's you don't have to build this extremely expensive battery. And so I think the first thing is the use case, and the second thing is where's the grid clean? Because I'm sorry, I care about carbon emissions, and I think it does matter. It's not just about, going down this cost curve. It's about, do we want to be putting electric vehicles in places where there's a lot of coal on the grid? I think the answer is no. And right now, there's not enough of a nuanced conversation about where the EVs are going.
Let's come back and talk a little bit about cost. Where are we now? Where do you see that heading?
So electric vehicles obviously cost more than gasoline vehicles, but that's coming down, and it will continue to drop, in part due to the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies requirements that, in order to be able to be eligible for a subsidy, the vehicle price can't exceed a certain threshold.
Okay.
And as the numbers come up, as more and more people purchase these vehicles, prices will continue to drop.
And subsidies go away, or?
Yeah, even when subsidies go away, I mean, we can achieve cost parity within, several years as manufacturers innovate and are able to take advantage of these large-scale demands.
Right. How much do they cost on average? What are we looking at?
So last year, the average MSRP for an electric vehicle was about $66,000. But I think we need to keep two main things in mind when we think about EV costs. One is they've got these big batteries, and the batteries are expensive. And they're expensive because they have all these metals that go into them, and that's instead of having a plastic gasoline tank, right? So we've made incredible progress bringing those prices down. They've come down about 90% in the last decade, so batteries are a lot less expensive. And I think one of the things we're about to see is a proliferation of choice in EVs. The vehicle manufacturers are going to create many more models, introduce many more models, including ones that are going to be less expensive.
Right. Are they cheaper to operate, maintain?
It depends entirely upon a few different things. One, where you live. So what's the price that you're facing in the utility service territory? Number two, what the gasoline price is in your neighborhood and in your region. And then three, what time you charge, because there's a lot of time variant pricing. And so depending on what kind of rates you're facing, and some people are facing real-time prices even, you can manage the charging to take advantage of the low cost time. So just thinking about an average price, electricity prices are on average X and gasoline prices are on average Y, is a total fallacy, because what that's going to mean for you is something completely different.
Right.
Maybe we don't want to just focus on averages, but electric vehicles are really efficient, and so the cost to drive a mile is typically a little bit lower. But I think that might have been a bit overplayed, because in the places where there are a lot of electric vehicles, like in California and in the Northeast, electricity prices are also very high. So if you're paying, 30 to 40 cents a kilowatt hour, then probably you're not saving much money driving an EV.
Right.
Now, EVs have a lot fewer moving parts. You asked about maintenance. And so, yeah, we think that EVs are not going to require as many service appointments, so they'll be less expensive in that way. But at some point, you're going to have to replace the battery.
Right.
And that's going to be kind of equivalent to replacing a transmission in a gasoline car. So, how this all plays out, I honestly don't think that people should be buying these based on whether they're cheaper or not. I think people have many more important factors that go into their car choice.
Absolutely, I agree. When people go to purchase vehicles, regardless of the fuel type, what they're looking for is comfort, safety, aesthetics. We want horsepower, we want performance, more than how much it costs to drive. I also have that issue.
Right.
One of the things that they care least about is the cost of fueling, and that has been true with respect to the gasoline market, and that's why the efficiency standards were so highly important.
We've been kind of spoiled by cheap gasoline for a long time,
Absolutely.
too. Everybody's mentioning subsidies. How do they work?
Well, I mean, we've got really big subsidy programs from the federal government and from many state governments. And so when you buy an electric vehicle, you can get a credit on your taxes that, the federal credit right now is about $7,500, but there are lots of complexities that are, being woven into that around means testing, where if you're very wealthy, you don't get the subsidy and the type of car you're buying. But I really want to focus in on these subsidies for a minute, because I think this is one of the areas where I think we're getting it wrong. These subsidies are being offered with a vision that the EVs are displacing gasoline cars. And I think there's two really important pieces of evidence that that's not happening. First, when you look at the vehicle portfolios of households that are buying these EVs, they're not getting rid of a gasoline car nearly as frequently as is being assumed.
They're just adding an EV.
They're just adding an EV, and a lot of the time they're not driving it as much. So there's dipping the toe in this market.
Right.
But the other reason why I think we know that these subsidies are expanding the number of cars overall in the country is because vehicle manufacturers love these subsidies. All right. Why do they love them? Because now they're selling a lot more cars because they're subsidized. So, I think if what we care about is reducing the pollution, then we need to shift our focus back to removing gasoline cars from the road, making it more expensive to drive gasoline cars, and a little bit less on how many EVs are being purchased, because these are not doing one-to-one what we.
How do you make it more expensive to drive gasoline cars?
Oh, well, I think we need to put a price on carbon. I mean, we keep on crying this from the hilltops, and it's out of favor politically right now. But if we really genuinely want to tackle climate change, we need to make it expensive to pollute.
Is that regressive? I mean, the people that have to drive to service industries and their gasoline's going up like in Europe, they can't even afford to go to work.
Yeah, it could be, and we really need to care about addressing that, but I think we need to separate these issues a little bit. We need to make it more expensive to pollute if we care about climate change, and we need a tax transfer system that is, making it easier on the low-income households if we were to do that. But we're going to look back 10 years from now, and we're going to see that these subsidies didn't work the way that we expected them to.
That's interesting.
Just on the point of gasoline taxes being regressive, that money that comes in from the taxes, it could be used, in part to fix up our infrastructure, but part of that could then be sent back to households based on their characteristics. So we can make these gasoline taxes not regressive.
Yeah.
And I also want to respond to what Dave had said about which vehicles are being replaced. I actually really think it depends on the data set you're looking at. So we have this really great data set in Massachusetts where we're able to track households over time. We know all the vehicles that they have in their household. We know when they purchase new vehicles, which vehicles they get rid of, and which ones they hold on to. And what we find is that households who purchase an EV are just slightly more likely to purchase that as an additional vehicle. And the second thing I want to point out is that we're not finding that households are driving these vehicles less. We're finding very similar types of patterns of driving when they purchase an electric vehicle. And in fact, one of the benefits of the household getting the EV is that as gasoline prices go up, they're able to shift the miles to the EV.
Will that vary by density of population, denser cities and denser places like Massachusetts, EVs, because you don't go that far, rural areas, harder?
Possibly, but we have data from all over Massachusetts.
I still think of the whole state as little, but we're in Texas, everything's little, except for Alaska. So what percentage of the EV cost, let's say unsubsidized, is the battery? What percentage, plus or minus?
This is a really good question. First of all, there's a lot of variation in the size of batteries.
Right.
And since the costs have been coming down so rapidly, that number has been changing a lot. But I have as my heuristic that a Tesla has about $10,000 worth of battery in it.
Right.
But I could be off by a couple thousand. But it's
plus or minus.
a major cost. And again, you're relating that to a plastic gasoline tank.
Yeah. So
yeah, but there's so much, and I just want to stress the point that there's been so much technological innovation on the battery side. Look at Ultium cells. Ultium cells is a collaboration between General Motors and LG Electric. And what they've done is they're creating these gigafactories that are creating this new technology of battery that are modular. And what it allows for is a much longer life of a battery.
Right.
That also uses a lot less cobalt, one of the main critical minerals. There isn't one technology of battery.
Yeah.
A lot of different batteries have different types of minerals and quantities that go into each.
Right.
And so with technological innovation, we could expect them to live longer, rely upon less critical minerals, and price come down.
So let's say we do get to 50% of the current vehicle fleet in the planet, which is 1.4 billion, electrify half that, 700 million EVs. Mm-hmm. There's 1 to 5,000 actual lithium-ion battery cells in an EV. You start to get into trillions. This is a big deal. How do we see this happening? How do we see the supply and price and minerals as we look out in the future? What's it look like?
Well, we started seeing the effects of this even last year in lithium prices that went up about 10x. And one of the risks...
10x, 1,000%.
1,000%. And they've come down a little bit, but there's still, we have a scarcity of lithium. And I think this is one of the risks that as we expand demand for EVs and batteries, that the input prices for the batteries, reverses this trend of declining battery costs. And then, it becomes harder to stimulate EV adoption.
Yeah.
The extent to which the supply chain restrictions on the critical minerals is going to affect EV prices is still sort of an unknown. But as critical minerals go up, we will begin to innovate. And part of the innovation in terms of mining is, for example, where are we getting these critical minerals? One really promising option is coal ash. Being able to find it from waste products of electricity generation.
Gotcha. So Maine has spodumene. It's a mineral, lithium-rich mineral, a lot of it, actually. Their legislature overrode their governor's veto, 35-0, they won't mine it. Yet they're going to mandate EVs. So here's one of the great challenges. Are we going to mine in the U.S.? How do you see that?
I think so, yes.
You think so?
I think, though, it's challenging. There's 3 or 4 different agencies, regulations that determine where we can and can't mine. And so I think it is a question of how do we go about taking a look at all these regulations and thinking, what can we loosen, make sure that that mining's done in a responsible manner, in a way that's not affecting local communities.
Right. It's where they come from, but also then who processes it. And China processes a lot of these things now, and good for them. They got out in front of it. And
we have one processing plant in this country.
Right.
So the question is, what does the permitting process look like to put in these processing plants here? From what I hear, is pretty challenging.
Yeah.
So we need, that sort of processing plant capacity within the United States will need to grow.
Yeah. How do you see it?
Well, this is something I've been thinking about recently in the context of China. So China has a larger market share in battery processing than OPEC does in oil. But I'm much less worried about it in this context. This is actually one of the areas where I think, it makes sense to keep an eye on that concern. But let's say that they decided to, withhold supply in the same way that, say, OPEC did in the 1970s. There are lots of margins of adjustment there. Right. We can allow the existing EVs to stay on the road longer. So instead of scrapping them when we get in an accident, maybe we fix them. Or we can, buy gasoline cars. And, I think we need to be aware of pressure relief valves for situations like that. And, when somebody cuts off the electric grid, there's really no substitute. When somebody cuts off the supply of gasoline, you're stuck without being able to go anywhere. It's not exactly the same with battery minerals.
In the U.S., electric cars now make up 5% of new cars sold. They're expensive, though, and their subsidies have gone mostly to the wealthy. But EV choices are increasing, and costs are decreasing, which could help further adoption. 85% of global EVs are sold in Europe, and particularly China, including many scooters. They use domestic electricity rather than imported oil, helping with energy security. But their electricity still comes mostly from coal, which partially offsets CO2 reductions. Our guests disagreed on the pace of EV adoption, with David advocating for preserving fuel optionality and allowing time for the grid to decarbonize, and Beia pressing for acceleration of EVs, concerned about the cost of other options. And there will be challenges with the supply, politics, price volatility, and security of the critical minerals needed to make the batteries. We'll talk more about subsidies and mandates in Part 2 of Electric Cars, Pros and Cons.
Funding for Energy Switch was provided in part by the University of Texas at Austin, leading research in energy and the environment for a better tomorrow. What starts here changes the world. And by EarthX, an international nonprofit working towards a more sustainable future. See more at earthx.org.